This episode is brought to you by my free 3-part video series, FAM 101. Discover how to chart your cycles by tracking the 3 main fertile signs: cervical mucus, basal body temperature, and cervical position, and ultimately develop body literacy by paying attention to your fertile signs. Head over to fertilityfriday.com/FAM101 to grab your free copy. That's fertilityfriday.com/FAM101. This is the Fertility Friday podcast, episode number 230. Welcome to the 230th episode of the Fertility Friday podcast. Thank you for joining me today. I'm Lisa from fertilityfriday.com, and this is your source for information about the fertility awareness method and all things fertility. I'm excited to share today's episode with you. In today's episode, I'm interviewing Angie Firmalino. And so for those of you who have Netflix and have watched a recent documentary that came out called The Bleeding Edge, you may be familiar with Angie. The Bleeding Edge is a really interesting documentary. If you haven't had an opportunity to take a look at it, I would, suggest for you to take a look. But, it's not necessarily a feel-good type of experience watching that documentary. The Bleeding Edge chronicles the stories of, mostly women. There were a few men who shared their stories, but mostly women. And it's really highlighting an issue with the medical device industry, highlighting how medical devices come, how they're approved and why sometimes these devices aren't necessarily safe for use, even though they have made it through the approval process. So it really highlights some of the challenges and issues in the way that medical devices are approved, and some of the dangers and the risks to, those who use these devices and are not necessarily informed completely about the risks associated with them. So in Angie's case, she used the medical device called Essure, and Essure is a device that was heavily promoted and is still, I believe at the time that this episode airs, it's still available in the United States, though it's not necessarily available in many other countries. So many other countries have actually pulled the device, preventing providers from suggesting it and selling it and implanting it in women. But in the United States, I believe that they're going to discontinue, but it's still actually available at the time that this episode airs. And so this was a permanent sterility device, a device that is inserted into the fallopian tubes, and the mode of action is supposed to be, scar tissue forming around it, making it theoretically impossible to conceive, therefore making it a permanent sterilization device. So interesting and just terrifying what happened once doctors started using this device in women, what some of those negative side effects that many women experienced. And of course, one of the side effects that many women experienced is pregnancy. So although it's a sterility device, it's not 100% effective in preventing pregnancy. So there's all kinds of information, and she shares her experience and her story with the device. And as I was watching that documentary, I felt compelled to reach out to Angie and ask her to come on the show and share her experience, because it was incredible to see how many women have been affected by this. I just felt an overwhelming sense of sadness. And there's many reasons for that. One, I just don't want any other human being to have to go through something like that. It's horrible. But on the other hand, you have these companies, and it's just incredible to think that they could create these devices, and there's information and evidence that they have that would show that there are issues with it, and that there will be a certain number of women in this case who will be negatively affected by it. But that doesn't change the marketing strategy. It doesn't change product design itself. It doesn't prompt further investigation. It doesn't prompt a safety committee to determine if it's safe and how they can make it safer. It just doesn't seem to play into the decision as to whether or not the device will be released. So even though the device isn't necessarily safe, the device is still sold to women. And so, tens of thousands of women have been negatively affected by this and other devices. Today's episode just focuses mainly on the Essure device. But yeah, so that's my little preamble for this episode. I hope that you enjoyed, and I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on it. And if you've actually had an experience with Essure, make sure to join our Facebook group for the Fertility Friday community. You'll find that over at fertilityfriday.com/community, and we will be talking about this episode in there shortly after it airs. So with that said, let's jump into today's episode. And in today's episode, I'm very excited to welcome my guests, Angie Firmalino and Amanda Rusmisell, to the show. And before I jump into the bios, Angie and Amanda were both involved in the most recent Netflix documentary, The Bleeding Edge. So I felt compelled to reach out to Angie after seeing that documentary. Anyone who's listening, if you haven't seen it, I would definitely suggest to take a look at it. So it's on Netflix. But if any of you have seen it, then you'll know why I was so passionate to invite both of these amazing women on the show just to share their stories. So Angie holds a Bachelor of Fine Arts in metalsmithing from Syracuse University and an associate's in psychology from Syracuse University. Due to health problems as a result of Essure, I'm not sure if it's Essure or Essure, she's no longer able to work as a jeweler. Angie founded an advocacy group against Essure in 2011 called Essure Problems. And when I checked that group, I think it has over 41,000 members or something like that. Amanda is a wife and mother to two boys in Charlotte, North Carolina. She holds her Bachelor's of Science from Appalachian State University and her Master's in Counseling from the University of North Carolina, Charlotte. And currently she works in the nonprofit sector. And Angie joined the Essure Problems group after being harmed from a medical device and having major surgery. So, both of these women are highly involved in activism, basically from the fallout that has happened from Essure, these medical devices. And in today's episode, we're going to be talking about the documentary, sharing the stories of what happened, and also just discussing what this means for women. So I just want to thank you both for being here and welcome you to the show. So welcome, Angie and Amanda.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Well, and so I'd love to just start by giving each of you an opportunity to take us through your story, whatever you think is most important, because I know just from watching the documentary that this has been an ongoing issue for a number of years for both of you. So maybe Angie, you can jump in first, and then Amanda, you can jump in second.
Sure. So in 2009, I was pregnant with my last child, and my husband and I decided this was going to be our final child. And I approached my OBGYN during my pregnancy and said if I were to have a C-section that I wanted my tubes tied. I had one child prior, but it was 11 years before this one, and I had a C-section with that one, so I knew that it was going to be a possibility that I would end up with a C-section. So that was in my birth plan. Unfortunately, I had an emergency C-section, and the on-call surgeon didn't know my birth plan, didn't do the tubal ligation. So when I went for my post-op with my regular OBGYN after the cesarean and told him, they didn't tie my tubes, what are my options? That's when he presented me with Essure. And Essure is a non-invasive, non-surgical sterilization procedure that can be done in the doctor's office. They go in vaginally with an instrument called a hysteroscope, and they place these medical devices into each fallopian tube, and it's supposed to cause the fallopian tube to scar over, blocking the sperm from reaching the eggs and rendering you sterile. So, it's not presented to you like that. It's presented to you as, this soft, flexible insert. We can do it right here in the office in 10 minutes. Doesn't hurt. You can go right back to work tomorrow. They hand you a brochure. It looks like you're going on vacation. It sounds fantastic. He's like, of course, you don't want to go have another surgery. You just had a C-section. So I agreed to this procedure, and I had it done 2 months after that visit. So for me, it was very painful. The procedure took way longer than 10 minutes. I was in there over an hour. I could feel everything. I remember just being very shaky, feeling all the pain. I almost passed out several times, and the pain continued even after the procedure. When I came home, I was just in a continued amount of pain. I was having a lot of bleeding. But every time I would reach out to the physician about it, they were telling me, it's just your body reacting to, the pregnancy. You give yourself time to heal. You had a C-section. Now you have this device. Just give it time. So I just gave it time, but nothing seemed to get better. And then over the course of 2 years, I started having a slew of other health problems. So fast forward to 2011, I went in for a checkup, and I had told the midwife that I had been bleeding for quite a long time, and she asked me how long, and I think at that point I had been bleeding for about 30 days straight, and she ordered an ultrasound, and that's when I found out my devices had expelled out of my fallopian tubes and were embedded in my uterus. And I had no idea that could even happen. That wasn't ever something that I was made aware of. That wasn't something that I even thought could happen. So that was the point where, things clicked in my head, and I was like, wow, this is bad. I need to warn my friends and my family members, stay away from this device. And I created this group called Essure Problems on Facebook, added a few friends and family members that were female, and said, this is what happened to me. Stay away from this device. And strangers, women that I didn't know, started joining the group and started telling their stories. And that's how it all started, this group.
Wow. From a few people to 40,000.
41,500 right now. It just keeps growing.
Well, and Amanda, did you want to share your experience?
Sure. So I had Essure placed because I went to my doctor after we decided that we were done having children and wanted to get my tubes tied. And he said, you don't want to get your tubes tied. You want to have Essure put in. It's non-invasive. You can go back to work the next day. And this was a long time ago. And so when I looked around, I didn't see anything online except for I remember looking at the corporate site and, I asked my friends and no one knew about it. And so I trusted him. My OBGYN, it's a weird relationship you have with your OBGYN because I have an 11-year-old now. A 12-year-old now because I trust my OBGYN because we have a few complications. And so you trust them that they're not going to, give you anything that's not good for you. And so I had it put in it was December, and it was not considered non-surgical, but I had it in the same surgical outpatient facility that I had my spine surgery in, actually the same room. And it was the most painful thing I've ever been through in my life. I remember I was begging them to stop and not to finish it. I ended up losing consciousness and woke up, and they went ahead and did the other one, even though it was really bad, and was crying and was throwing up, and they put me in the recovery room. And then they said, oh, this is just your body, you're just overly sensitive. And then I remember I was discharged and still getting sick. I remember being at home one time and telling my husband, I feel like I made a mistake because I was in so much pain, because it was you could almost feel it. It was when they first did it, it was like a pinching on the inside. And I was in a lot of pain, and my boys were little then. And I remember calling in and saying, I think there's something wrong. And they said, no, your body, it's just your body. And they put me on pain. I was on pain medicine for about 2 weeks. I don't remember, kept questioning. I thought, this didn't hurt. And then over the next 18 months, my periods ramped up to the point they were debilitating. And then literally I was bleeding through a Super Plus tampon and a pad in 15 minutes for 7 days, all day and all night. And I started calling my doctor and saying, something's not right. This is before I joined the group. Something's not right. And he said, oh, it's just you're reacting to it. None of my other patients have had any problems with this. So if you look at my records, you'll see that the calls got more frequent. And then he said, it has to be something with your thyroid. I went and had my thyroid checked, and it was normal. And I remember when he told me it was normal, I started crying, and he was like, why are you crying? You should be happy. I was like, there's something wrong with me. And then I went to a variety, back to my doctor, back to the OBGYN. And then he so casually said, well, we're just going to have to give you a hysterectomy. And I was like, what? And I did the complete ugly cry in his office. And he couldn't understand why I was so upset. I was 38 at the time. And so I had the hysterectomy. It was really, really rough for me to recover from that. It took me a good 6 weeks. And then I healed and life continued. And in 2013, we were cooking Thanksgiving dinner, and the story came on, and it was a little blurb on local news. And literally my husband and I both stopped in our tracks and he said, there was this program. It was a news story, and they were talking about the Essure Problems group, and there was a Facebook page. And I remember I put what I was cutting down and ran and joined it, and we had 2,000 members. And I remember I came back in, and I was like, yeah, I wasn't the only one. All these women are having problems, and now we have 41,000 people in our group. And I remember I joined, well after I had my hysterectomy, and when I went through all of that time period, when I was bleeding so much and I was confined to my house, I was missing work. It was incredibly dark time because all I kept hearing from my doctor was your body's failing you and no one else, is having problems. And come to find out, there's a good handful of my doctor's patients in our group now. So, and come to find out, we were all complaining and we were all hearing the same thing from him. So, and then it just kind of spiraled. You join the group and you feel compelled to help and compelled to do something, and you kind of each member kind of steps into their own where their strengths are. And I think that's one thing that's really remarkable about our group.
Mm-hmm. Well, to be honest, I mean, I heard about Essure. I heard a little bit about it, but I never, it's like we're all busy doing our own little things. And I didn't really take the time, to educate myself about it. If you know what I mean,
Mm-hmm.
it was kind of in the periphery.
Mm-hmm.
And being skeptical of all things, just the things that they sell to women to manage their fertility. As a person on the fertility awareness side of it, I would have been skeptical of it just in the general sense, but I didn't really know a lot about it. And so watching the documentary, I think what's interesting about the documentary is that, I mean, it's about medical devices in general, but it just so happens that it's women that are just, much more likely to be negatively impacted by these devices. So just to give the audience a sense, so we've talked about it. Angie described how it's put in. But anything else that we need to know? Do you know about when this product came on the market? And so about how long it's kind of been? Do you kind of know any information about how many women who've used it over the course of its lovely duration?
Yeah, I mean, we've been living Essure for 7 years as far as researching and reading and diving into the history of the device. Initially, it was a device that was being used to try to open the fallopian tubes. Women that were having trouble conceiving, they were trying to find a way to open tubes that were either scarred closed or they were too small. So they looked to heart stents and they're like, okay, so we have these things that you can put into an artery that holds it open and helps, the blood flow. So let's try to do that to the fallopian tubes. So they came out with this device and they called it START. And they put them into the fallopian tubes and the opposite reaction happened. They noticed that it was causing scar tissue to grow and these women's tubes were closing even more. So they're like, okay, well, this isn't going to work for the purpose that we wanted it to, but let's use this information and create a birth control device with it. And then it turned into, this is a sterilization device. So the name START turned to STOP, and they became clinical trials into this STOP device. And the trials ran from, I think, early 1997 or 98 up to 2000. And they enrolled a few hundred women. They were studied for up to 5 years. I think by the time it came to market in 2002, there was about 196 women that had been studied. 5 of them had been followed to 36 months. I think that was the longest that women had been followed, and 5 was the maximum number. So they bring this to market, and it's here in the United States, 2002. All over the rest of the world, this device is being used. We don't have a denominator because since this has been brought to the media and, we've raised all this awareness, Bayer, the company that owns it now, has been using the same denominator for the last 5 years in the media. 750,000 kits have been sold worldwide. They've stuck with that number for the past several years. It doesn't change. So we honestly don't know how many women have been implanted because kits sold doesn't equal women implanted, because we know many women that have had 3 or 4 kits opened and used on them, if something went in wrong and had to be removed, etc. So at least I'd say 600,000 or 700,000 women around the world have this device, 40,000 plus in our group, but then we run 50 subgroups. We've got groups all over the world. We've got groups in France and the UK and the Netherlands and Italy and on and on. So, we've really been communicating with women all over the world that are experiencing the same side effects, from this one device.
Well, and talk to us a little bit about, so in some countries, this has been pulled from the market and all of that kind of stuff. So talk to us just a little bit about that and where the United States falls into this discussion.
Oh, goodness. I think it was Brazil, Amanda. I think Brazil was the first country to pull it voluntarily. And they
pulled it for a little bit. Yeah.
They pulled it for a little bit and requested more information from the manufacturer. Then the manufacturer provided a little more information and they brought it back to market. But then the CE mark was up for renewal. And the CE mark is kind of like the FDA approval for our country. The CE mark grants approval for a device in the United Kingdom, Ireland and the Netherlands and all these different countries. So when it came up for renewal, they asked Bayer for more clinical data and more information because they were seeing all these problems. And at that point, instead of providing more information, Bayer decided, you know what, we're just going to pull it from the European market. So it went off the market everywhere except for here in the United States. So our group, who had been fighting the longest, was stuck with this device when everyone else in the world had it removed. So we've been battling with the FDA for so many years now to try to get them to take some sort of action. And they've taken little steps along the way, nothing that has been successful, and still to this date hasn't been successful. But in July of this year, Bayer did announce that they will be discontinuing sales at the end of 2018. And, doctors have up until that date to purchase Essure kits, and then there will be no more.
And I think it's really important to highlight our fight with the FDA. I mean, they started banging on their door in 2011, I think that's right, and really banged on their door for 4 years. Had some little meetings along the way, and then in 2015, we had an FDA panel meeting. And that is where they have different doctors and experts, like dietitians, immunology doctors, OBGYNs, some consumer advocates. It's about, 12 people, I think, were on that panel. And then Bayer presented information, the FDA presented information, and then you could sign up to speak. And I think we had about 150 members of our group that went. We had a good handful on different topics that spoke. And then after that meeting, they convened and then came out with the black box warning and the patient checklist. Now, I think the big thing about that, it was not mandatory at that point. It was just kind of like, hey, you might want to go over this stuff. And the black box warning didn't do a lot of good because women didn't see it. It's not like when you go to the pharmacy and it says it has a black box warning on it and you get that material. And so we do a lot of tracking in our group and asking questions and keeping, like, when you got Essure implanted, were you told about the black box warning? And that people were not. And then we continually were meeting with folks in Congress and folks at the FDA. Several meetings occurred after that meeting. And then in February of this year, we went and met with Commissioner Gottlieb. There was a group of us that went and met and kind of showed him the information that we had. This is how many adverse events are sitting in your system, which he had no idea what data he had in his adverse event system. And then here's what we found, this many women who've been implanted that were not told. And I think he was honestly a little shocked by that. And then after that, he came out and said, the FDA came out and said that the black box warning and the patient checklist was mandatory, meaning doctors had to go over this with their patients so that you would get full informed consent. Now, we have been also tracking that for women who are still getting implanted, and we're finding women who are not implanted. So I think that's really important to show that this is not informed, right? Mm-hmm. And so it's really important that, our group is 41,000. It's a support group. Hey, this is some of the things that I've done when I had my hysterectomy that helped me. This is how you can talk to your doctor. This can help with you at work. And then it kind of moved over into an advocacy realm too. And so it's not just about Essure now. It's about the entire process of how some of these devices are getting on the market and the current, with the current atmosphere, it's more like, let's just open the door and push them to market faster. And so we're kind of moving into that realm and, our fight is not over yet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I'm sure you saw that one clip in the Bleeding Edge where the approval meeting for Essure, where they were joking around and asking all these questions that had no answers. And then, the one doctor asked, what happens if in 10 years we find out this device is not effective and women are getting pregnant? And the other advisory panel member says, well, they're going to hire private investigators and hunt us down and ask us why we approve this. And everyone laughs. I just remember sitting there watching that and just cringing, like, this is our FDA approval process, really? And I think that's kind of what spurred us on this mission to make some changes, because this is just blatantly unacceptable.
Mm-hmm. Well, on the same lines, so I do want to get to kind of the broader implications. So I'm kind of zoning in on the Essure part at this point, but this is kind of like a two-parter question. So it's kind of like, first of all, I want to ask this question because I want to get the discussion out of it, not because I believe that all these women have it and it's great for them. But were there women who had this device implanted and didn't kind of immediately have these same like horrifying, like, you know what I'm saying? Like, were there women that had this device and didn't necessarily experience pain with insertion and potentially didn't experience some of these effects? So that's like kind of like the part one. And then the part two is, because I think the documentary touched on this a little bit, like how were those clinical trials done such that this could be approved? Given the horrific negative effects of this device, how is it possible that it passed?
Okay. Yeah, I mean, well, part one, yes, we do have women in our group that have the device and that are currently healthy. We've talked to women that had, a seamlessly painless insertion, and everything went fine, and theirs only took 15 or 20 minutes, and they went home and they were good. So yes, there were women and there are women who are not having problems. But at the same time, we have women that were good for a year or 2 years or 5 years and didn't start having problems until year 7, year 8. We just had one woman who passed a medical device, a coil, through her vagina during her period, and she had the devices for, how long was it, 14 years? She had the devices for 14 years, and all on her period a week or two ago, one of the devices came out. So, we've seen so many things and such a wide variety of reactions that there's just so much unknown. But the variety
I think also you need to point out that sometimes there's a lot of women in our group who, after they had it removed, are still having problems. They have autoimmune issues. They have all these different issues. And then there's some women that don't have all these other problems that women are having. And there's been no studies to say why are some people reacting this way, and some people react when they have it, but then they don't have any reaction afterwards. So I think it's kind of like there's so many facets and so many arms to this of the unknown because there's been no studies.
Yeah, I mean, we are the clinical studies, and like Amanda said, there's, the obvious things like migration, perforation, allergic reaction, but then there's the systemic stuff like the autoimmune issues and, fragmentation during removal, or just there's so many facets to this device and problems that can happen. It's hard to, give any idea of what number of women have a bad reaction and what number of women are going to be okay.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's kind of like how it is with anything, because we are all different. So you can give, 1,000 women the same drug, and there's just, every woman isn't going to react the same way. So I think it's really, right. I think it's important to kind of ask that question, because there's always people who would say, well, I didn't have any problems with it. But right. That doesn't mean that it's safe. Right. Just because a certain percentage of the population didn't necessarily have the egregious effects. So tell me a little bit then about how, like, just the approval process, because I feel like I remember they said something in the documentary about how women's symptoms were recorded.
Yeah. So I think we're up to about 25, 27 women from the original clinical trials now in our group who are having problems. Most of them have the same story. They weren't told what the materials were. They were told it was stainless steel, when in reality, it's a nickel titanium outer coil, a stainless steel inner coil, and then PET fibers, which is polyethylene tetraphthalate, and that's the mechanism of action that causes the inflammation. So initially, they were told these are stainless steel, so initially lied to. Then, whenever they would present with a problem or any type of side effect, they were told it's not related to the device, you need to go see a specialist for that. Or you need to go see your OBGYN for that because it's not related to the device, but it's a female problem, so you need to see somebody else. So they were kind of getting dismissed and sent around, and even a few of them were dismissed from the trial. They were sent a letter saying, you are no longer needed, we've collected all the information that we need from you, and you no longer need to be part of this trial, when they were supposed to be followed for 10 years. We had women that were sent this letter after 2 years, after 4 years. Then we had women start asking for their medical records, and we got up to three women that got their actual clinical trial medical records. All three of them had evidence of information being crossed out and changed, birth date change. And then when we went public with it, every other one of those original clinical trial participants that tried to get their medical records were told those weren't kept. We don't have them anymore. They were destroyed after a certain amount of time. So once we went to the media with it, magically all that information was gone for everybody else. So the 3 that we did get, yes, they were altered.
Yeah, there's, sometimes when you have a sense of like, oh, I think there's something going on here. But like when you have a situation like this, it's so overt and egregious that there's no even question as to what was going on here.
Yeah. Right. That's what fuels our fire.
Yeah.
We know that we know that we know, but yet you put in a FOIA request, which is a Freedom of Information Act request, and you can do this and ask for certain documents, and it'll take us a year or 2 years to get something that we requested from the FDA, and we get it, yet it's completely redacted, which means all the information is blacked out. I remember asking for, some study on one of the clinical studies, and I got 430 some pages, and 300 of the pages were big black boxes. Just everything completely blacked out. So it's like, why is there even this process of Freedom of Information Act, and you ask for this information, but they redact it and they can't tell you anyways? What is the point? It's frustrating. It's very frustrating.
Well, and so you mentioned, go ahead.
Even going back to the FDA meeting, like when we met with them in 2015, they would ask a question and Bayer would say, well, we don't have that information. And the FDA would say, whatever. And then we would be like, hey, we know the answer to that question, but we weren't allowed to respond. We were only allowed to speak in our time period. And so I think that was our 2 minute. And if you went over, they cut you off. And it was funny because like, we were like, even the panel was like, I think they have the information, and they wouldn't let us speak. And they were like, if you speak out of turn, you're out of here. Like,
oh, that just makes you, it's like the patriarchy is like blinding right now.
Oh yeah.
Well, so I do want to get into, I do want to get into some of the overarching themes here. I just wanted to, so we've touched on some of the side effects of this. And if you wouldn't mind just kind of going through some of them, because, and maybe more specifically, some of the immune effects, because I know you mentioned those a couple of times. I remember one of the things that struck me when I watched the documentary was that it was kind of like some of these doctors may or may not know how to insert them, which makes me wonder if, some women have pain, some women don't, like maybe, you just don't know the answer to that question. But then the other thing that struck me was that like, if they inserted it wrong, they would just like reach into the box and like insert 3 more. And some women would have like 8 of them in there. Good God. So maybe, like the side effects of it and just kind of some of that, I don't even know what to call that, to be honest.
Some of the side effects, and I'll let you talk about the insertion and removal, Angie, if that works. Because some of the side effects are, there's such a variety. We have women who are allergic to it, and they're like breaking out from like their chest down to their legs. Or other reactions too. We have women who are losing hair. We have the bleeding, the pain, the pelvic pain, lack of sexual intercourse. We have so many different autoimmune diseases, lupus, Hashimoto's, rheumatoid arthritis. What are some of the other side effects? Just people getting pregnant.
Migration, and perforation. Yeah.
Or people they've done the HSG test after the 3 months and they're considered blocked. I, for instance, went to lunch with a woman here in Charlotte one time. She got pregnant like 7 or 8 years after it was inserted. And she's like, I have a kid going to college. Like, this is, and this is not like, you don't know what your reaction is going to be. And a lot of times you get this inflammation, like you look like you have a 6-pack in the morning, and by the afternoon you look like you're 6, 7, 8 months pregnant. And this is just not in the stomach. You get inflamed. It sets off an inflammatory response all over your body. And that's the biggest thing right now. What can we do?
I think that's due to the mechanism of action. So that these polyester fibers that are wound in around the inner coil, they cause this chronic inflammatory response. That's what causes the scar tissue to grow. And they talked about it during the approval meeting, and they talked about it at the 2015 public hearing. How do we know that the body's inflammatory response is just going to turn off once it's done creating the scar tissue around these devices? What if the woman's, inflammatory response doesn't turn off and just goes into overdrive? Is that what is setting off this autoimmune reaction for so many women? And I honestly believe that. And I also honestly believe that improper removal can attribute this problem as well. Like if the devices are pulled or cut or broken during removal and little tiny pieces of these fibers are spread throughout the woman's abdominal cavity or reproductive cavity, it's going to just intensify and increase this inflammatory response and, cause your autoimmune system to go haywire. So, we've seen that again and again and again, and that's what happened to me when mine were removed. So I'm living proof of it, but to watch it every day, it's just horrifying, and there was no removal protocol when this device came to market. There was nothing in the instructions for use for the doctors. There was nothing in the training manual for doctors about how to remove this if something goes wrong, because it was never intended to be removed. This was something that was supposed to be permanently implanted in a woman's body for her life. So, doctors were just kind of, I guess, winging it, trying to figure out how to get these things out, and unfortunately failing a lot of the time and leaving pieces behind and causing more damage. So, over the last couple of years, we've had a few doctors working with us that have really tried to create some type of removal protocol and, share it with other physicians so that women can try to regain some of their health if they get them removed properly. And sometimes they do. Sometimes they don't, but sometimes they do. So,
well, I know,
difficult.
yeah, one of the things you mentioned was that, even some women develop these problems after removal. And then I just have this image in my head of like, you try to remove this thing and like pieces break off and then it's just in nowhere land. How would you ever find them? So did you want to briefly talk about kind of especially for a woman who's listening to this and has the device, and maybe that's why she tuned in and she's thinking like, well, how do I get this thing removed? So obviously joining your Facebook group and connecting with women who have been through it and can, provide information. But what are just some things you'd want someone to know if they want to have this device removed?
Yeah, well, definitely join our group and speak to so many other women, but we do have a link on our website that is dedicated just to Essure removal protocol, and we kind of have the steps of what you need to go through, and we have some resources of physicians that have helped other women in the group. It's definitely important to have imaging done to locate the devices first and foremost before you even go into surgery, because these things have migrated into so many different places in the body. There's an adverse event where it was found in the heart. We've seen them in the liver, the spleen, the spine, the appendix, the stomach, the cervix. We've seen them everywhere. And if you don't have imaging before surgery and the doctor's just assuming, okay, these are in the fallopian tubes and uterus, and they go in and they remove the fallopian tubes and uterus, yet they didn't know that one had migrated to the appendix, now you're looking at another surgery, or other complications. So imaging, first and foremost, locate them. And then talk to your physician about what is the best plan for you, because really it depends on where they are. You can't just say, I want my devices removed, because although some specialists can go in and do a microsurgery and delicately open the fallopian tube, and, it's a very complicated and very precise surgery that very few surgeons can do. So if your surgeon is not one of those surgeons and yours just a general OBGYN, they might want to just remove the fallopian tubes and uterus to make sure that they get everything out intact. Some doctors can remove the fallopian tube and the top portion of the uterus, and that's called a wedge or a cornual resectioning. So there's a couple different procedures, but it's going to depend on where your devices are, what your surgeon is capable of doing, and, take it from there.
And I also think it depends on what symptoms you're having too. I mean, because in my case, I firmly believe had I just gotten my tubes with the device out, I would still have, because that inflammation had been set off in the uterus, that I would still have that heavy bleeding. So I think that you need to take into account your symptoms too. But again, there's been no studies.
Right.
We keep a file of women who've had, surgeries, and we have a plethora of information that no one has shown any interest in.
Yeah. Yeah. And like for me, mine were in my uterus, and they thought that they could just go in and take them out and then tie my tubes. And at the time I knew no different, so I allowed that to happen, and she did end up breaking them inside of me. So then several years later, I ended up with a total hysterectomy. But, had I known then what I know now, maybe I could have prevented that. So we want to help these women prevent having, improper removal. So we guide them as best that we can, give them the information that we know, share with them the doctor's information that they've shared with us, and just try to guide them and pray for the best.
Mm-hmm. Well, Angie, in our pre-chat, so before Amanda jumped on the call, I was saying to you that, when I watched that documentary, I didn't really feel surprised that this was happening. I just felt this intense feeling of just sadness, kind of like on behalf. It's like if you can kind of appreciate the concept of the collective feminine. So we're all women, and there's the women that came before us. And somehow I believe that we're all connected. And I felt this deep sense of sadness that this is still happening, because this feels like something from the Middle Ages, right? Like, this is insane.
Yeah.
So I just, wondering if you want to kind of comment on that sentiment.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Women have been the focus for birth control and sterilization forever. The focus has never been on men. There's vasectomy options, but that is never pushed. It's always seems to be the woman's responsibility. And they have been trying for decades to find a way to sterilize women in an office setting without having to undergo surgery for as long as, surgery was an option. And it's always failed. The fallopian tubes are meant to push the egg down. It's their job is to push things down and get the egg into the uterus. And nothing in the fallopian tube seems to want to stay in the fallopian tube. And everything that they've tried up into Essure didn't work, and Essure certainly didn't work. So maybe it's time to look at this from a different perspective. And maybe, it's time to start teaching women about our body's natural cycle. And I was never taught, how to watch my cycle and learn about my cycle and learn when I'm fertile and not fertile. And, we're not teaching our young daughters about this. We're just like, here, take a pill. Here, use an IUD. Oh, get your tubes tied. We're not doing this naturally at all. And I think that's an education that needs to be presented to young women so that they know that they're, they can control their fertility. Well, not control their fertility, but they can learn how to know their own fertility cycles.
Mm-hmm. Amanda, did you want to?
And I think that's important. Yeah, I think it's funny because I have people come to me and say, so since you've kind of in this advocacy realm, what device or what pill would you recommend? And I was like, honestly, none of them. And I know that's just my personal opinion. But I mean, I think Angie's right. Like, when I started, looking at doing some contraception, no one ever said, hey, the doctor never said, hey, did you ever think about like, what is your cycle? I was listening to one of your podcasts and you were talking about like charting your cycle. You know what? I mean, I haven't had a hysterectomy like 7 years ago, but I could not tell you like how far apart my period was, like if you asked me that. And I think that's very telling. Like, it's kind of scary because you don't want, a lot of people do want really large families, but that wasn't something that was in my forecast for myself. And so you turn to your doctor and you trust these doctors for various reasons, and then you end up being harmed, and it's just sad. So
and we're not against birth control. We are definitely pro safe and effective birth control, but I definitely believe that we're missing this information. We're not teaching our daughters, about their bodies and about their fertility cycles. And I think that should be something that we're teaching the next generation so they don't have to go through this. I mean, when I was a teenager, you just went on the birth control pill when you became sexually active. That's just what you did. There was, very minimal conversation. You went to your mom, she took you to the OBGYN, they put you on the pill, and nothing was talked about, and it shouldn't be that way. There should be more conversation about our bodies and how our bodies work. And I think men also should be taking a little bit more of the responsibility of contraception and, sterilization.
Mm-hmm. Well, because men don't want their loved ones to have to deal with a lifetime of health issues because of, the birth control option that that doesn't even make sense. And there was another theme. So when you were talking about your own stories, but also talking about the stories of the women who experienced, varying degrees of this inclined to say foolishness, but it's much more serious than that word. But one of the themes that emerged was this, I had like your intuition is screaming at you. There's something wrong here. Mm-hmm. And you're going to your trusted practitioner and saying, look, like this, there's something wrong. And I think it's because of this device. So your actual true intuition is correct. And then what's mirrored back to you is basically like, you're crazy, silly woman, go home and, take a nap.
Yeah. I think Erin Brockovich summed it up the best when she said, if 60,000 men's penises were falling off, the world would stop. But a woman having a problem with a medical device, nobody bats an eye. No doctor believes you, but if a medical device was in a man's private area and they went into the doctor and said, this thing hurts, the doctor would be like, oh, well, let's take it out then, but that's just not how women are treated. Not at all.
And I think that it also brings in so much other information. Like, for instance, like we have insurance. And so that gave me, it was much easier for me to get my doctor to do something. But there's this gap of women who either don't make too much and but yet can't afford insurance. So there's this gap where they can't get anything done. And so a lot of them, are working jobs, and the side effects cause them to lose their jobs. Because, for instance, I was missing almost a week of work, a half a week of work every month because I couldn't go into the office. And I think that there's these women who are like kind of just left to be on their own, who there's no resources for them to help. And I think that's the scary thing, is you have these people that are completely suffering and they have no options with this. So, and I also think another thing to point out is how much all of this impacts the family. Like, for instance, the children, marriages are falling apart financially. There's just such a wide realm of how it impacts. Like, I'm sure if you sat both of our husbands down and talked about how we were during this time and after, and how it's changed the dynamics of our family, it's amazing. Like, I think you would be really surprised.
Yeah, it's an enormous change. We're nothing like we used to be, and it's unfortunate. It should never have happened.
Mm-hmm. Well, and is there, when you hear things like this, there's a part of me that hears that and just thinks something has to change with regards to the patriarchal way that medicine is operated. That concept of father kind of daughter situation when you go to a doctor, where this person is in that role, this paternalistic, I know everything, you know nothing, I'm the expert, you, like that type of relationship that historically has prevented us from even questioning anything from our doctors. Yeah. How would you, I'm trying to formulate a question around that, but it's essentially, for the women who are listening, especially younger women who are kind of discovering, like I remember when I was like 19 or 20, right? Things are a little bit different when you're a little bit younger. But even for older women, this is still happening. So like, what is there a lesson in here that can leave us feeling a little bit more positive in terms of like, trusting our intuition, questioning our doctors? Like, what advice do you have for women to navigate this?
Come together and unite and advocate for one another. We call each other e-sisters in the group, and we will meet up with a woman that we've never met in person, but we've known them in the group. And if they're going to a doctor's appointment and they're nervous and they don't know what to say, we're here to go with them, and I've seen this happen numerous times. Someone's like, because we've also broken off into state subgroups so that you can find your local e-sisters. And we're doing that. We're advocating for each other, and there's power in numbers. You walk into the office by yourself and your doctor can kind of put you in a corner and make you a little bit afraid, but you walk in there with someone else and you feel a little bit stronger. And the doctor might step back a little bit because now he's looking at two strong women and not just one scared woman by herself, So there's definitely strength in that, finding your people, finding your power and finding your voice. Don't be afraid to tell the doctor, no, that's not right for me. Or listen, I know my body, I am in pain and I need you to help me. And if you're not going to help me, you work for me, I fire you, I go find somebody else, and they'll listen to that.
Mm-hmm. I just want to, Amanda, did you have anything that you wanted to, always trying to navigate?
Well, I think it also, I also think it's important to like reach out to groups. There's so much information on all these different products, not just like gynecological products, but there's so many groups out there, and there's so many advocates that are willing to talk to you. For instance, my son was in the hospital for 3 days for an entirely different reason. And from some advocates that I met, like literally I was calling them going, what should we do? And there was a lot of, I heeded their advice. So, do your research, search on social media, reach out to people. We get messages from people we don't know all the time, and we're happy to help. Like, hey, I don't know anything about the device, but I know somebody that does. Let me put you in touch with that person. So I think that's important, not just for young women, but like all across the board, to educate yourself and know what's going on.
Yeah, knowledge is
products and drugs. I think that's important to note.
Well, what I appreciated about the documentary is it really highlighted, it put the spotlight on the medical device industry, something that most of us don't really think about. Because I know, like I said, I haven't really given it any serious critical thought. You kind of assume that if you go to your doctor and you need a hip replacement, that the thing that they're going to put in your body has been tested. You know what I mean? Like you wouldn't necessarily think that you need to like research the material that's in it to verify like the likelihood of you having a reaction to it. And with the documentary as well, it wasn't just the Essure. There was several, like I can't remember how many, but there were several specific devices that were highlighted. And many of them to me look problematic from the onset. I mean, what you said, Angie, at the beginning was that they told you, oh, you just put it in or whatever, however they mentioned it. But then when you described what the procedure was, where, they put it in there and scar tissue builds around it due to this process of inflammation, I'd have been like, are you crazy?
Yeah. And
No,
that's not
I
how
decline.
it's presented. Soft, flexible insert, the body makes a natural barrier. They choose these words to, make it sound all simple and great, when in reality, if you really knew what was going to happen to you, you would never choose it, And we can't just rely on our doctors, because the doctors are fed this information from the medical device industry and the FDA. Now, the FDA is supposed to be looking out for the people. The FDA is supposed to be protecting us and making sure that drugs and devices and food and everything is safe. Yet, industry and FDA are working hand in hand. And there's this huge conflict of interest where people are going back and forth between industry and FDA and industry and FDA. So they're all friends, and they all have these like common interests and these common goals of, more, push more through. There's no money for post-market surveillance or regulations. It's all about getting more on the market. And so all this information that's coming from the manufacturer and from the FDA to the doctors, and the doctors are just blindly believing them because they think, oh yeah, the FDA must have done clinical trials. They must have, made sure that this was safe and effective. So I'm going to present this to my patient. So it's not even the doctors are 100% to blame, although a good majority of them are also taking, financial incentives and gifts and, things as well to push their products and their drugs. But, we can't rely on that anymore. We can't just blindly rely on the doctors and the FDA, because we have to rely on ourselves. We have to educate ourselves and do our research.
Well, and how do you, so as you're talking about this, and I'm kind of thinking about what that would mean, I mean, because it's no one's saying that, medicine hasn't done amazing things for the world, and everyone needs to have a doctor. We all need to have a doctor. But there's definitely the sense of like, okay, but I really need to, be skeptical of, I have to be skeptical. I have to have a healthy degree of skepticism to basically anything that's ever suggested to me. So I would imagine that there are people out there who just think, well, that's just too much. Like every time a doctor gives me medication, then I have to go and research it. And every time there's any procedure, that's kind of what it means. So how do you navigate that? It's a huge responsibility then, because if you can't always just take your doctor's word at face value, and if it's the responsibility lays on you to do your own research every time, that's it feels like a heavy kind of responsibility. So how would you speak to that?
I think you have to. In the world that we live in today, where everyone has a phone in their hand or a computer in their house, and information is at our fingertips, and all you have to do is Google something, I don't think it's that hard. Maybe a decade ago, when we didn't have access to this worldwide web of, infinite information, was much more difficult. But in today's day and age, it's fairly easy, and there are ways to look things up. And, a normal human doesn't know what an adverse event report is until they've had a bad reaction and come across it. But I think that's another piece of information that needs to be disseminated to the world, that if you have a bad reaction to a medical device or a drug, you can report that to the FDA so that they know that this is happening in the real world. And if your doctor prescribes you a drug or a device, you can go to the FDA's website and search for that in the adverse event reporting system and see how many people have reported problems with it. That's out there. That's accessible. And people don't even know that that exists. And that's part of our advocacy work with our nonprofit, is teaching people these things that we didn't know until we were harmed. But now that we've been through it, we want to share it with everyone. Hey, this is out there. You can do this,
Mm-hmm. And I also think there's other sites too that your listeners need to be aware of. Like, say you want to have a hysterectomy and your doctor's pushing that it's done robotically. You can look up on Dollars for Docs or open payment data, and you can search and say, hey, this will tell you how much money they've been given. And they're pretty specific on about who it's from and what. And that can lead you to say, hey, this doctor has a vested financial interest in this certain product. So maybe I need to look and go to somebody else who's going to give me more options to do. And like, had I known that looking, I might have chosen a different doctor, because I might have had more options. Because if you're not receiving a financial interest in it, they might have more options for you.
Yeah. And I mean, I know we sound very cynical and we sound very we're putting out all these warnings, and we've been through something horrible, so we're advocating about it. But we know that there's life-saving drugs and there's life-saving devices out there, and there are great doctors that have, all the best interests of their patients at heart. We're just saying that do your own research when you're presented with something so that you can make an informed decision. We weren't given that option. We weren't warned what this device could do to us. It wasn't there, it just wasn't there. That information wasn't there, unfortunately. So now the information is out there so that women can go and say, oh, I've been presented with Essure. Let me go see what's out there. And now they can see the pros and cons. They can go to the manufacturer's website and read all the pros, and then they can come to our website and they can read all the cons, and then they can make an informed decision.
Mm-hmm.
And I think also it's a good policy to say you have the option not to work with the first doctor you go to. So if you go to a doctor and for some reason that you don't like the way he's presenting, or you don't feel comfortable with him or her, you can go to another doctor. And there are really good doctors. Like, I have some really good doctors that, I truly trust, but they know my history, and they know that I'm an advocate, and they know that they come prepared to answer my 50,000 questions that I have for them.
Yeah.
And they're okay with that. And that's the kind of people that you want to work with. And I think that's the biggest thing, is you don't have to go to the first person you see.
Yeah.
So.
And if your doctor is put off by you asking questions, maybe that should be a red flag for you. You should be able to ask questions about your medical care. That is your right. It's your body. So if they shut you down, or they're condescending, or they don't want to answer your questions, get a second opinion.
Well, I mean, nothing's going to change for women until we demand better.
Right.
And I mean, if there was a spectrum, what you've both experienced is quite high on that spectrum. Many women have experienced things that would fall kind of lower on the spectrum, but that are still horrifying, right? Like, that are still adverse effects of medications or different things, and not being listened to and being ignored. And that theme that came out, I feel like, because I know you said, we sound pretty cynical, but I feel like the medical system has shown us that there are certain kind of predispositions that just don't help women out. One of them is the tendency to dismiss all of our symptoms. I mean, period pain wasn't even considered to be a real thing. And recently, a bunch of men realized that the pain is actually serious. Right? It's crazy. Yeah. It's crazy. And so I think it's maybe it's a wake-up call that just the way that medicine was designed from inception, scientific testing being done mostly on male animals, we are only now starting to even think about respecting women in medicine, it would seem.
Yep.
Oh, definitely. Totally agree. I mean, also it's an age thing too. I mean, one other thing my doctor told me, he told me my problems were because I was getting old. At 38, that went over like a lead of bricks. I just literally, I started running after I had a hysterectomy. That's the kind of thing, like, this is not about age. And one other thing we see a lot with our women, I think that's important to talk about, is not to let them mask your problems with a drug or something else, and make them treat the symptoms before just masking. And I think that's another thing, like, whatever I can do to get these women to stop calling or stop bothering me. And I think that's the one thing I felt. But yeah, you're totally true, totally correct that this is a systematic problem.
Mm-hmm.
Well, so as we kind of bring our interview to close, like I said, I really appreciate you coming on the show and sharing your experience. And I think it's important for women to hear these stories, and especially the discussion that we had around advocacy, because I feel like what came out of this interview is the importance of trusting your intuition. So that's something that, I mean, you can both attest that your intuition immediately was like ringing. But it took a long time before anyone else listened to that. And I think, one of the hardest things for us to do is to actually trust it, to trust that feeling that we get, the gut feeling right from the get-go. Because, I mean, it's either you're going to listen now or later. It's never going to stop going off.
Right. And only we know our bodies. We're living inside these bodies. Nobody else is. So you're not crazy. Don't be led to believe that you're crazy. If you're having pain or you're having a problem, it's your body. You know your body. And you're right. It's women's intuition. We know.
Yeah. It's kind of like the difference between a woman who's supported and a woman who's not is the physician, whether or not the physician's going to listen to her problems and take them seriously.
Right.
And I think it's also important, one thing from our group is to come together. And as Angie said earlier, I mean, we wouldn't have been in the FDA. We wouldn't be in the halls of Congress promoting the Medical Device Safety Act. We wouldn't have the chance to tell our story in the documentary had we not all come together and kind of work together and find that common ground. I think that's huge, and just keep talking with everybody. Like, my coworkers know, like, somebody has to get a hip implant. They'll come to me and say, what do you know about it? And so just be open and give them resources. I think that's a huge thing, is just never stop talking, because you don't know whose life it could change, because they get the right medical treatment that's not going to harm them, or they could go the opposite way and get a lifetime of problems.
Right. There's no shame in telling your story. Like, when I started the group Essure Problems, it was because I didn't want to talk about my birth control problems on my personal news feed. So I wanted to make this separate area and just add women. Oh, you should see my news feed now. It's all about all about the female stuff. So I don't, I've gotten past that, and we have to get past that fear and that shame. There's no shame in talking about it.
Well, I'll give you both an opportunity to those are amazing words to end on, but I'll give you both an opportunity, if you'd like to, if there's one thing that you want the listeners to take away from this interview. You may have done it already, but I just want to give you the opportunity to just kind of close it out however you would like to.
Amanda, you want to go first?
I was hoping you'd go first.
I would just like to say, where women can find us. We have a Facebook group called Essure Problems. It's Essure. We have a website, essureproblems.webs, webs.com. Our nonprofit organization is called ASHES, Advocating Safety and Healthcare E-Sisters. And now we've branched out and we have a website called medicaldeviceproblems.com. So if you have any medical devices and you're having any issues and you just need some support, or you need some information, or you've been offered a medical device and you're trying to make an informed decision, reach out to us. We're there. We have joined forces with people that have had other medical devices. So we have this huge think tank and this huge pool of people to share resources with anybody that has any questions. So please, don't be afraid. Don't be ashamed. Reach out to us. We're there 24/7.
Definitely. And I think mine would be to educate yourself. do a lot of reading, watch the bleeding edge, understand the process, and understand that follow your hunches. Like if you get a weird feeling, wait and do your research. Also, encourage everyone to support the Medical Device Safety Act of 2017. It is going to help revamp the process, basically for products like Essure that went through with pre-market approval, the preemption clause, and basically restore your right as a consumer to litigation. So definitely support that. Reach out to your members of Congress, both in the House and Senate, and ask them to support that bill.
Yes, and if you want more information about the Medical Device Safety Act, you can go to our nonprofit website, which is ashesnonprofit.com. Go to the little tab that says MDSA, Medical Device Safety Act. You can read about it there, and then we have a very simple template that you can copy and paste and send off to your rep, asking them to support this bill. It is very, very important. A lot of devices go through pre-market approval, and when they do, that means if you're harmed or if you're injured, you cannot sue the manufacturer. And we need to change that, because holding the manufacturer accountable for injury is what makes them take a product off of the market. If they are not being held responsible and they're still making money, they have no incentive to take it off the market. So going to court when you're injured and, holding them responsible is the checks and balances in the system. If they're not being held accountable or liable for injury, there's no incentive to take it off the market. So it's a very important bill. So we please ask that you support that.
Well, and I'll make sure to connect with both of you and grab all the links to the different websites you mentioned, to the Facebook group, so that the listeners can go to the show notes page and connect. So thank you again for being here. This is a really important conversation. I'm really glad that we were able to have it.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed today's episode, please share it with a friend. You'll find the show notes page for today's episode over at fertilityfriday.com/230. So I hope that you enjoyed my interview with Angie and Amanda. It was such a great opportunity to chat with both of them and to hear both of their stories and experiences. So I just want to thank both of you for coming on the show and just really sharing with us what happened. And if anything, for me, that documentary brought up a lot of emotions and feelings, and the interview brought up a lot of emotions and feelings as well. It's kind of hard as a woman to sit down and listen to those stories, because it in many ways it feels like a personal attack on the female body. It's kind of like, how could you be so reckless? How could you approve and sell a product that had all of these signs that it would have these negative side effects? How could the profit motive come ahead of the health of tens of thousands of women around the world? And so it's like a cautionary tale. It's an example of the worst case scenario, but it really does highlight some of the challenges with our medical system, where every time you take certain types of medication and use certain types of devices, I think we all know by now that all medication, all different things come with side effects, and it doesn't mean that we should never take those things. There's a lot of medications and devices that we really need in order to improve and optimize our health. But there's two key takeaways that I took from today's interview and also from the documentary itself. One of them being the importance of informed consent. So as a consumer of these products, somebody who is relying on the healthcare system, and we're relying on the guidance from our physicians, from our healthcare providers, it's really important that before we take any medications, before we use any devices, have anything implanted into our bodies for long periods of time or forever, that we really take the time to research and find out what those side effects are. It really highlights this challenge that most of us face, where we kind of leave it to the professionals to guide us and to advise us of what is the best thing to do. So we kind of give up our power and give it to the professional, because we assume that the professional knows everything. We assume that they wouldn't be recommending something if it wasn't safe. And then if you have questions and you ask, many times, many women have experienced that, where you say like, well, I'm concerned about this aspect of this medication or that. And often the care providers will really downplay that. And well, that's not even something you need to worry about. Don't even think about that. That never happens. And so it really highlights the importance of having informed consent and really taking it upon yourself to make sure that you are fully informed about whatever it is. So even if it seems minor and benign, you're taking a certain type of medication, you're being recommended something that is fairly common, I think it's important to look up the risks and side effects. Not to say that you should never take a medication. Of course, we all, take medications from time to time, but knowing what those risk factors are, knowing what they can do is important. I mean, even Tylenol has risk factors associated with it, or ibuprofen, for example, like those really common medications that we just take for headaches and those types of things. So just, whenever you're taking medication or something like that, informed consent, you have the right to know exactly what is in that, what some of those possible side effects are, and what, maybe there's the side effects aren't necessarily associated with that one time that you use it. But many of these devices in particular, so devices specifically for women aimed at, fertility, aimed at birth, like for birth control, as we all know, these devices aren't something that you use like once or for an hour or something like that. These are often devices that are inserted for, years, 4 years, 5 years, 10 years. So before you have a device inserted into your body for a long period of time, a half a decade, a full decade or more, it's, you have the right to do a quick search online, see if you find any negative side effects, whatever the medication, the device, type it into Google beside the word side effects. So if it's like IUD side effects, see if there's any support groups on Facebook that you can join of women who have used them, and listen to their stories, find out what real women have experienced when using these devices. So, few of the devices that are out there now are new. And so many of these devices and medications that we would go to for different things, they've been out there for years. So you can actually find groups of women who have used them, women who've had positive effects, what that looked like for them, women who had negative effects, what that looked like for them, how long it took for those negative effects to show up. So many times, with different types of devices or different types of medications, sometimes there won't really be symptoms right off the bat, but then at some point they'll show up. Other women will have symptoms show up right away, and then other women won't have any. But I think the important thing is to really find out, like, what could actually happen if I use this? If someone says, like, it's completely fine, there's no side effects, that's not a real thing. When you're having devices inserted, when you're using different types of medications, especially medications that interfere with your natural hormone production or anything else related to reproduction, all medications, all devices have side effects. And so the important thing to do as a consumer in order to ensure that you are informed before you use something or have something inserted or something like that is to really take that time to find out what is the worst case scenario here. It's like, what is the worst thing that can happen? And between the worst thing that can happen all the way to having no side effects that you are aware of, what are all the things that could happen in between? And what have real women experienced with this product in particular? And yes, so utilize the amazing time we're in, utilize social media, utilize Facebook groups, because women who've used different devices are typically very happy to share their experiences, both positive and negative, and give you some guidance in terms of like what, just their opinions. And basically what I'm saying, it brings me to the second takeaway, which is buyer beware. It's like we have to take the responsibility when we're choosing something. I feel like that the Bleeding Edge documentary, this interview today, it really highlights the fact that it would be so nice if we could just defer 100% of that responsibility to our healthcare providers, if we could just blindly trust them and just like, they know everything, they've done the research, they've gone to school, and if they recommend something, it has to be good. Like, it would be really, really nice if we lived in that world, but what we clearly don't. And healthcare providers are informed, but to what extent, are they going to tell you about every single possible side effect? Are they going to really, stress to you that this is a real possibility that it could happen? To what extent do they even know about all of the side effects associated with the medication that they're providing? Some healthcare providers will pull out the warnings and have you read the whole insert, and other healthcare providers will tell you that it's completely fine and send you on your merry way. So really, it's time for us as women to take back the power and the control of our fertility, of our bodies. But that's not easy, because when you take back that power and control, it means the onus is also on you to really to kind of do your own due diligence before you use a product or buy a service or something like that. So really, really important, but very complex conversation. And frankly, it's quite uncomfortable because it kind of goes against how I grew up, which was the medical system, very paternalistic. The doctor is like a father figure. You go in there and, he pats you on the head and tells you what to do, and then you leave doing what he said to do, and you don't question any of it. So we have to break that, because obviously that model is not serving us. If devices such as the Essure device can get through and be implanted in tens of thousands, if not more, women, and cause just an incredible amount of damage, both physically and emotionally, to women all over the world. So that was kind of a long aside, but I felt compelled to share it. So for those of you who are still with me, thank you for taking the time to listen to today's episode. I am very interested to hear what you have to say, what your thoughts are about this episode, and about kind of that broader issue of these devices and medications aimed at women. What are your opinions? And how do you think, as women, we should be managing these risks? What do you think is the best thing for us to do to try to, ensure that we're healthy and we're safe whenever we're using different types of devices and medications? So join us in the Fertility Friday Facebook community. Head over to fertilityfriday.com/community. We'll be chatting more about this in there. And yes, so thank you so much for tuning in. Have a wonderful weekend or week, depending on when you're listening to this episode. And as always, until next time, be well and happy charting.